Welcome to episode 5 of God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is the third episode we record today because we're going through the definitions of God, the attributes of God, and we're on a roll. So we're going to get through as many as we can today. We're recording on Monday, October 27th, and now it's 3:27 Eastern time. And so, all right, so like we went through God being the creator, God being the supreme being, the principal object of faith, omnipresent, omnipotent. So now we're going into what to me is the most difficult one. And I'll explain once we get into this. But Josh, get us started. How, Wiki defines God as being omnibenevolent. How do we see this?
Well, it's sticky for most people. Most people do have a hard time with it, not because omnibenevolence itself, but because it's hard to reconcile. It's contradictory to the other ones. If God is all powerful, then how can he also be all loving? Why couldn't he have made a world that's complete bliss with no pain, suffering, disease, pandemics, hurricanes, right? And so kind of the solution that you know, in wrestling with this myself and talking it out with George, kind of the solution that helped me to embrace all of them at the same time and unify them is the concept that omni doesn't mean necessarily God is only love. It means more specifically anywhere that love is happening, that is God. And for me, that's just much more powerful, much more useful. And, we got a short life on this planet and a lot to do. And focusing on that allows me to realize, if God is all powerful and he's anywhere love is happening, so anywhere power is happening, anywhere causality is happening, and anywhere love is happening, that's God. If I understand both those, then I can understand that power, understand that causality to be in communion, be in relationship with the loving attributes of God by understanding how love happens and why it happens.
All right, and I share that view. I mean, basically, I like to see God, if I can use an analogy, as kind of like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde character. And I think it was Dr. Jekyll who's the evil guy, right? This guy who just like has this two personalities. So God seems to have a good side and a bad side. And this isn't anything that I'm kind of like conjecturing really, that's opinion. I mean, if you go to the Bible in Isaiah, God tells Isaiah, I create light, I create darkness, I create good, I create evil. So, but what Josh was saying, I think is right. Like, it's like, where there is love, where there is goodness, that's God. And God happened to have created us as hedonic creatures, meaning we seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's our basic operating programming. That's who we are. And given that, then it makes sense that we want to see God as goodness, and we want to relate to the part of God that is good. If God has other parts that aren't good, God didn't make us to want to relate to those parts. So God is omnibenevolent. Now again, in my mind, the problem is, of course, that, well, if God is everything, then God, and God is all powerful especially, then we have to attribute everything to God. So we keep that in mind, and I think, what I do is I just like maintain an optimism and a hope, not just that we're hedonic creatures, that we seek pleasure and avoid pain, but that we're getting better at it. In other words, God being good and evil, or a combination, is important to us because we're sentient beings. We feel pleasure and feel pain, and naturally we don't want to feel pain and suffer. So what gives me a lot of confidence in our reality and in seeing God's goodness and relating to God's goodness is that we are, millennium by millennium, century by century, decade by decade, creating a better and better world for everyone. We still have our challenges. We have to include the animals. We have to stop this factory farming. We have to end global poverty. We have some problems we still need to address. But this world for so many of us is so much better than it was 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago. And that's what I think we mean by God is good and God is love, that God is leading us to a better and better reality.
Certainly, George. And I think what I have understood now is, you know, thinking about how good and love are somewhat synonymous. So, all good, we're all loving. We have another term of unconditional love. And what is unconditional love? What does that mean? And really, for me, it's being able to be good to people, right? No matter their situation, how they're acting, or how they're thinking, or whatever it is, and being able to treat them in the best way that I can. And I imagine God doing the same for us. Um, and so for me, that's really helped me to integrate all these attributes and try to live my life out better, using all of them and not just having to compartmentalize, well, this happened because God's all powerful and, God is all loving. So I should be loving only in certain circumstances so I can be more like God, but I can't really be any more loving than I can. But through understanding these attributes, it has helped me to do that, and understanding real causality and understanding, why we are the way we are and how a relationship and understanding and meditating on these attributes can improve that step by step.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a virtue to love unconditionally. That's an aspiration we all work toward. Um, Relating this to God's omnipotence, in my life, what I like to think is, well, what makes it easier to unconditionally love people, even though I may, want to avoid certain people or just not, act according to how they act, in order to not judge them, to love them notwithstanding, it's good to remind ourselves that God is all powerful. So in other words, like, yes, a person may not be behaving in the best of ways, but it's not their fault. This again, getting back to this matter of free will that we're going to be going over again. If God is all powerful means all powerful. All powerful means not just that what's happening outside of us is happening because of God, but what we're doing is happening because God is essentially compelling us to do this. So again, like when we understand God's omnipotence relative to human behavior, it just makes it so much easier to unconditionally love each other. And that obviously is going to enhance the happiness and well-being of not just those who we're loving, but of ourselves as well.
Certainly, George. I think that really brings it all together. And maybe that brings us into the next part of this article, of God being eternal, which we've touched on in some of the previous episodes, but we could visit again.
Yes. All right. So, all right. If you want, so God's being eternal. I mean, it's interesting because eternity is another difficult concept because as human beings, we wrestle with that because, like, how could God have always existed? Because we're always thinking, everything we know of in our world had a beginning. Even our world, our universe had this big bang as a beginning. So it's hard to conceive of God, of reality, of everything having constantly, eternally existed, which is gazillions of years times gazillions of years. I mean, like, it's just like, put a one and like an infinite number of zeros, each you're representing a million years or whatever, and like you're not even approaching the
Yeah.
extent of eternity. So all right, so Josh, what are your thoughts on this? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I jumped into it because what you'd said about omnibenevolence and all good kind of dawned on me. God is eternal, of the creator, the original creator, and again, still creating, still playing out. Not just the laws of physics are playing out, but all causality that we don't understand, and all of this being God and you know, our journey to understand it more. You know, our ability to evolve these forms of consciousness and concepts, and all science and psychology and philosophy evolved out of religion. If you look at the history of it, um, that God is eternal in the sense that He started creation, and God creation is still playing out, and it will be the future. So to, to treat someone badly, or treat, the planet badly, or treat ourselves badly, we're not just we're not just doing that. We're also, in a sense, um, treating God badly, right? Treating, and we need to view it that way. We would never, intentionally treat God badly. Nobody's going to go to church to learn how to treat God badly. That doesn't make sense, and there's no value in that. Yet we find ourselves doing that naturally, and doing that when we treat each other badly, or treat ourselves badly, or treat this knowledge that we've been developing collectively as a species together, whether it be scientific or spiritual, or theologic. Um, and so, the eternal part for me is to, almost viewing the eternity as the eternal attributes of God, as the Spirit of God, as a, a part of God in a very real way, just like I would view it as God.
Right. And when I think of God being eternal, again, I remind myself that God is everything and that we are a part of God. So, in a certain sense, we are eternal. And the way that helps me is sometimes I worry. Sometimes I worry about my life. Sometimes I worry about, the future of humanity. We've got climate change, we've got challenges. And then I take the big picture. And this is like something that they advocate in philosophy sometimes. When you look at the big picture, when we look at that there was not only an eternity in our past, but there's going to be an eternity in our future, that the span of our lives is infinitesimally minute relative to this expanse of eternity. So that helps us to not take everything as seriously as we might in terms of worrying about things that might happen that are so, like, for example, I really, many of us are working for an ideal world, a world where everyone's virtuous, everyone's very happy, everyone's very healthy all the time. We're going to get there. We're absolutely going to get there. I'm very confident. It may take 50, 100 years, 200 years, whatever. But again, relative to this eternity, it's going to happen, the next moment. And that's a great thought to keep in mind.
Yeah, certainly. And I guess that might bring us up to the next part of
I just wanted to, like, just one last thing about eternity. Again, if you're going to be really rational and logical, you kind of like, like, in other words, like, well, how do we know that everything's eternal? It could have begun at some time. Because, like, I have to acknowledge to myself, I have to admit that both possibilities seem to transcend my experience, my logical experience. My logic, in other words, like, for a lot of these other attributes, God is being everything, God is being creator. Logic and science dictates that, informs that. But in terms of, like, proclaiming that God and everything is eternal as opposed to having been a beginning, to me, it seems a more reasonable conclusion than to believe that God had a beginning, because then we'd have to ask, well, all right, so who created God, or how did God create, or what existed before this beginning? So, all right.
Yeah, um, I think that also ties in well with the next point in this article of God being a necessary existence. Um, on Wikipedia, if you're on a computer at least, and some phones will do this as well, and it's a really great feature they just added. Anything that's hyperlinked in blue, you no longer have to click on the page to look at that article. You can just hover over it and get a little snapshot, and um, it just really helps for going through an article really quickly and getting it deeply. So if you hover over necessary existence, it says in philosophy, a metaphysical necessity, sometimes called a broad logical necessity, is one of many different kinds of necessity that sits between logical and nomological. So, you know, I'm not sure how this, I haven't explored this area a whole lot. I don't know if you have, George, but I mean, for me, the necessary existence, a big part of it is almost that we are finite tiny creatures with tiny brains and tiny lifespans, in proportion to the whole cosmos and all the knowledge that there is in the world. So I almost view it as, how could you look at how science has progressed? They had to have a hypothesis, right? So to, this desire to know and this desire to discover and this yearning to come up with new understandings or better understandings, right? And so for me, that seems to be part of it. To view God as a necessary existence that has to exist for our minds, our evolution, our spiritual enlightenment and journeys to progress. Right? Maybe you have a different take on it, George.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Basically, I see God as a necessary being. The way we're defining God, in other words, like if we define God as everything, well, everything is another word for reality. And so, like, in order for us to be having this conversation, for us to be doing this show, reality has to exist. And so, like, God, God defined as reality, God defined as everything is necessary. Nothing would happen without God existing. As everything. God, another kind of like things happen. Things happen because something happens to make them happen. If we define what makes things happen as God, it's necessary for God to exist because something has to necessarily make things happen. I think it was Leucippus, a Greek that back, I think it was 300 BC, somewhere around, I don't know. He said like all things happen, nothing happens at random, but everything by necessity. And so yes, God is a necessary existence. Eternity seems to be necessary. Again, that's a tricky one, but reality is necessary. And if we're defining God as reality, that God is everywhere, everywhere has to be a necessity. So absolutely. I don't know the distinction between the logical necessity and that nomological, whatever the necessity they're referring to. But, with the basic meaning of necessity, you can't conclude, again, this is like important. Many people believe or have faith that God exists. It's much stronger than that. This is saying God absolutely necessarily exists.
Yeah, let's talk about the metaphysical necessity part and that word metaphysical, because I think that is an unfortunate consequence of um, our religions and our concepts of God not evolving, that it's became more and more metaphysical, all right, more and more less based in reality than previously. Like we talked about the hurricanes and the pandemics, those are acts of God. We call them that still, but you have to understand the people that came up with these terms and ways of thinking really believed that God was the only causality, and there was no causality like we think of today as meteorology or biological diseases, right? And so, you know, this metaphysical concept is another semantic, ambiguous term, right? What one generation thinks is metaphysical, the next generation may be able to prove scientifically in physical terms. And that doesn't mean, I think we lose so much if we, don't realize that those are one and the same in a sense. So, we may be going throughout our day and we may have to pray to God to help us with something or to explain something, get us through a situation, right? And we're praying to a metaphysical being in the sense that we don't necessarily understand the physics because we're not an expert, but there may be some scientists out there that could explain it, rationally. And just because we discover this science reason doesn't mean the metaphysical approach is no longer valid and that they can't be unified, because, any behavior change, you can be told what to do, told what the right thing to do. You can even say, I'm addicted to video games or the internet or alcohol, and I know I should stop and I want to stop, and science says I should stop, but that doesn't mean that you can stop, and almost never means that you can stop. So for, with addiction, with Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, the first of the 12 steps is that you have to believe in a God that can bring you through this and heal you. They've got tons of scientific data and research and psychology about how to cure and heal addiction, but still that is the gold standard. That's the best method. Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 steps is still the best method, and that's still the first step.
Excellent. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think the previous conceptions of metaphysics, metaphysical knowledge, separated nature and God, or just posited there was something outside of nature, whether it's consciousness or these numinous qualities of reality. But, as we've been discussing, God is everything. God is nature. There's no way to transcend nature. If God is everything, there's no transcending that. So like basically, the metaphysical construct is of a previous age where they divided what's natural from what transcends or is outside of nature. And I think we understand now that even with our known universe, we have a known universe that's 14 billion, almost 14 billion years old. But we understand conceptually that there must have been something before that universe, and this known universe, that spans however many light years. That's just how much we can detect with our strongest telescopes. We kind of have to posit, at least, that outside of the nature that we know, that we can perceive and understand, there's a more expansive nature that all is defined as nature or God.
Yeah, all as nature or God, and God maybe even. And this, this might bring us to the next sentence in this Wikipedia article on God, that all these attributes are used either in way of analogy or are taken literally. And I think that's wrong. I think they need to, update this Wikipedia article and realize that it can be and or. They can, it could be taken as literal and as a way of analogy, right? So it could be metaphysical and scientifically, literally. And we have to, these two different ways of thinking, they both exist inside our brains, every one of our minds, right? And we can't divide the mind like that, because that will, keep us from being whole and keep us to be able to think and act and have relationships from a whole brain perspective. And it always, seems to cause debate and argument and never really get anywhere.
Yeah, and then you mentioned this a couple episodes back, that some of this stuff, a lot of this stuff really basically is about semantics. If you're defining nature as what's distinct from God, then yes, metaphysics makes sense within that perspective. So it really, depends on how we're defining these terms. Okay, so let's see, we've got about 5 minutes left. We might be able to get into one more this episode, a very interesting one, incorporeality, which really, moves right into, the semantics of this. So Josh, start us off with that.
So incorporeality, or immaterial. All right. So it says God is most often, held to be incorporeal or immaterial. And incorporeality is the state or quality of being bodiless, immaterial, not composed of matter, having no material existence. So here, Wikipedia, whoever's authored this page, which is many people have put it together, and they're saying mostly God is thought of as being immaterial. And I think George and I both have a big problem with this, and I think that's what we've been talking about this whole episode. This is where many religions have led us astray, or rather, many religions have, done what they do best, and that is, spiritual worship services, theological discussions. But we can't be all things to all people, and the churches, the religions aren't filled with scientists. And hopefully George and I, through these discussions of bringing together both types of belief, faith and logic, we're uniting that and healing this aspect of kind of a split mind in our collective psyche and view of God.
Yeah, and this view that God is both material and immaterial, it's known as pantheism. Basically, the universe and God are synonymous. It's the view that Einstein held. It's the view that Spinoza held. And it's the view that's most logical. Again, if we go back to God being the creator and God having been everything, before God created everything, then if God creates a material universe, then there's nothing for God to have created that material universe from than God. And God continues to be material both before and after this universe that God has created. And that's important because like to believe in a God that's immaterial is to separate God from us, is to complicate our seeing God in everything, in other people, and the people in our lives, in ourselves. Again, like to the extent that we see God as both material and, in a certain sense, immateriality may be a complete misnomer. It could be, we could define the totality of reality as material. There's just some material. For example, 96% of the known universe we know is out there, but we can't interact with it. We know it by its gravitational effect and all, but if 96 of the universe is quote unquote immaterial, or is material, but we don't know it's out there, we can probably suppose that what we're suggesting is immaterial is really material that we haven't yet explored. All right, so we've got less than 2 minutes left. So again, we're exploring one by one the attributes of God based on Wiki's article, which really represents what most of us within the, especially Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, understand as God. We've got a few more to go through, and we may actually want to revisit this, incorporeality one when we start. Now this is airing on Friday, so we've got we'll see next Monday for the next one. But we've got transcendence to go through, and the purpose of this is to help us better understand God, so we can better relate to God and better relate to each other. All right, Josh, we've got less than a minute. End the show for us.
Yeah, this has really been a great time for me and helped me a lot. I don't know that I'd be sitting down and doing this if it wasn't for you inviting me on the show, inviting me to do this, and I hope it encourages other people to do it as well. And I just appreciate the opportunity and excited to be here doing it.
All right, we still got like 34 seconds, so we got to talk about something. Let's talk about God.
Again, let's bring it back to love, relationship, and happiness, and that dwelling on these and understanding these, that's the purpose. So God doesn't need him to define us, and we're doing this for our own benefit. And I think that's the point.
All right, so thanks for watching. We'll be back again on Monday with another episode. Have a great weekend.